Now, Lord, may you speak through me, or if need be, in spite of me, as we meditate upon your word as you've given it to us. Give us wisdom and understanding, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Everybody needs a place that Winnie the Pooh would have called a thoughtful spot. A place to go and think things through. You probably have one, even if you don't call it that. A favorite chair. A place to go where you can just sit and think. In Strathroy, Kathy installed a pond in our backyards where she would just go and sit, listen to the trickle of the fountaining water, and mull things over. Some people like to be in motion. They have a spot where they go where they're in motion. When we were in Prince Edward Island and I'd get stuck on sermon notes, I would tell Kathy, well, I'm going to go convert the dog again. And I would take the dog for a walk. We'd go up to the trail and we'd go a mile in one direction and then come back. And by the time I got back, I'd usually figured it out. Another colleague of mine was in Winnipeg for several years. And Winnipeg has a 100-kilometer ring road that takes you around the city. And he would hop on his motorcycle and he would take a 1-hour drive around the city. And by then he would usually have figured out what he was trying to deal with. For some folks, though, the place that they do their best thinking is here. And I'm not talking in the tub. I had 2 weddings that I went to in a very short period of time where people who got up to say the speeches both said, well, you know, I wrote this morning when I first got up and was in the bathroom. And I really wouldn't have brought it up if not for the fact that Martin Luther reveled in the story and told it often around the table of his home when students and those who wished to learn from him would gather, that he was in the bathroom when he had his great revelation, his great epiphany, that God's grace is for all people. It was in 1515. He said during a bout of intestinal troubles that had plagued him for most of his life, he dashed off to the little monk's room, and while he strained physically with one issue, he said he was straining mentally and spiritually with the others, and at the moment of physical release, he had the spiritual one as well. That man is not saved through his actions, but through the grace of God. Luther was born in 1483 in a little principality in what we now call Germany. He was raised to be a scholar and a lawyer. Though when he was almost struck by lightning in 1505, he saw that as a sign that he was to enter a monastic life. And he became an Augustinian monk, and he entered an Augustinian cloister. And he later said he was a good monk. To echo Paul's own words, he said, if anyone could have gained heaven as a monk, I would indeed have been among them. However, the other brothers in the monastery saw things in him, and they refused to let him stay cloistered and shut away from the rest of the world. He returned to his university studies, completed a master's degree, a doctorate, and he became a lecturer on the law and the church. Now, it should be remembered here that a university education is not intended to teach you how to do something. It's actually intended to teach you how to think about how things happen and what things do. Luther was taught to question the words of others, from ancient wise men such as Aristotle through Augustine, Aquinas, and even some of those who were considered most learned in his own day. In 1512, he started into a series of sermons on the various epistles. He was preaching through Romans, Hebrews, and Galatians especially. And in these letters and in other areas, he found himself confronted by the thought that his works, his actions, his step-by-step approach to earning God's forgiveness was fruitless. The way of the church, he said, was not being truly reflected from the Scriptures. There was nothing in the Scriptures about delayed salvation, nothing in there about unconfessed sin holding one back from the glory of God, nothing that could be construed as a basis for the doctrine of purgatory. And those who have been his students for any length of time later said they began to notice a change in what he was saying and how he was preaching. Now, as anyone who has heard a good Reformation Sunday sermon knows, the whole doctrine of purgatory and the church's assertions about it were what led to the Reformation itself. And the question of indulgences is in there as well. As wonderful as it was to contemplate, it was really just the last straw, but it was a major one in Luther's mind at least. Many other things around indulgences were brought into question first, so we need to define it. An indulgence was an action taken or a thing done to lessen a person's penance, or to alleviate their time in purgatory after their life on earth was done. So as you can see on the graphic, you've got, if a soul was free from sin, it would go to heaven. A soul with venial sins, that is, small sins unconfessed, would go to purgatory until they were now free from their sin, whereas souls with mortal sins would go straight to hell. That was a basic understanding, Catholic understanding of how things worked. Purgatory is not an original Catholic concept, though. Any culture that had prayers for the dead dating back thousands of years before Christ, any culture that had that obviously believed that the dead were somehow separated from the bliss and the peace that were promised to them by the gods. And so they would pray that they would be released from this time and from this place. Basically, that their sins be indulged and their punishment allowed to lapse. Example for you. When my daughter was 13 or 14, still lived with us, she did something that incurred a 3-day grounding. We said, for 3 days, you'll have no friends over, you don't get to go play with friends, no talking on the phone, no internet, no nothing like that. The very next day, she got home from school about 3:30, got off the bus. We didn't get home until 5 or 5:30, depending on how things were going with what we were working on. She got home. She went into the kitchen. She opened every cupboard. She opened every drawer. She took everything out, put it on the kitchen table. She grabbed a bucket and a handful of rags, filled the bucket with soapy water, went from the top down to the bottom, all the way down to the floor, wiped out every shelf. Then she wiped down every dish, every pot, every piece of kitchen utensil, every piece of cutlery. She put it back in place. As we got home at 5:30, she was just finishing the sweep. And we came in and we looked at the kitchen that was just sparkling. And she said, Mom, Dad, I've done 2 hours work. Can that take the place of my 3 days of grounding? And we said, yes. We indulged that thing that earned a 3-day grounding, and we said 2 hours work pays it off. Now, as a quick aside, we all know that grounding is the go-to punishment in today's world, right? Everybody knows kids don't get strapped in school. Nobody gets daddy's belt if they misbehave. And if anybody here was to hear in school, I had to go cut my own switch last night, you'd be in a foster home before you hit the ground. No. You are grounded. You are put in timeout. You are separated from the things that you want to do and must wait your sentenced time before you get to do them again. We had 3 kids. We had a lot of groundings to keep track of. So now, say a child does something that earns, that earns mom and dad's wrath. They decide to argue about it. Parental counseling advice today says you do not yell back at the child. You set your ground firmly, the punishment clearly laid out, and you just calmly speak to the child. So the child's yelling and screaming. You say, you go to your room or you are going to be grounded for a day. Child keeps screaming. Now it's 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Round about 5, the child realizes that you are not going to yell and scream. You are not going to spank them and then, go into the guilt hole. Oh, I shouldn't have spanked my child. And they storm off to their room and they slam the door shut. 6. So now you have a child facing a 6-day grounding. In an hour or so, they come down to you. Their eyes are puffy and red from crying, from rage, fear, embarrassment, all 3. Who knows? And they say in a quiet voice that they're sorry, and they ask you to forgive them for what they did and said. Now you face a choice. Not regarding forgiveness, because it is right to forgive. We are commanded to forgive. Yes, we forgive you for what you have done. But what do we do about the punishment? Do we let the punishment lapse? Or do we insist that it be carried out in part or in full as a lesson and a discipline for next time? Some parents would treat the sentence as discipline. Do it now. Remember that this is the price for what you did so that you don't do it next time. Seems logical. Makes sense in the context of the penal system that we all know, where we insist on at least part of a sentence being served, even if the wronged person says they forgive you for what you did. Here's the thing we discovered, though. If you ground your child, you can ground them from their friends. If you've got more than one child, you can't ground them from each other. And they get playing with each other, and in our house, it was never a case of, oh, how sweet that is. It was, oh, when's this going to go up in flames? So now it breaks out again, and you have a similar argument. And, a couple days in, 3 days into the grounding, whoa, wait a minute. Now the child's gone off to their room again. They've got 6 days on top of 3 days. And in a few days, they're going to have 6 more. And it could go on like that. And you get to the point where you can't catch up. And the church was saying, God did it that way. That even if you confessed and did penance for the thing that you confessed, paying those off and being done with them, He was all-knowing and all-seeing, and He knew all the sins to which you didn't confess, and He held those against you. And at the end of your life, you still had to pay those off. And they named the place where this was done, they called it purgatory. And Luther was starting to see that this didn't really reflect the grace that was being spoken about and written about by Paul and the other epistle writers and Jesus in the Gospels. Instead of grace, he was seeing an earthly accounting with proposed celestial tally sheets and ledgers and things you did held against you until they were paid off, perhaps thousands of years of sin to be worked off before you entered heaven's gates. He noticed that in penance, priests were starting to add in little extras to penance demands. No, don't just do the rosary once. Do it twice. Do it 3 times. It'll take your time off at the end. Go to a shrine. Contemplate the godly life of the saint that's there and how you need to change yourself so that you become more like them and not like you are right now. One of the most interesting penance sites I've ever heard of is the Scala Sancta. This is the staircase that leads up, one of the staircases that leads up to the Lateran Basilica in Rome. Steps were brought back from Jerusalem in 326 by the mother of Constantine the Great. And she claimed that they were from the governor's palace. Therefore, these were the steps that were in Pilate's palace that Jesus must have either ascended or descended on the way to or from his trial. These are steps where Jesus supposedly walked. The 28 stairs were installed where they are today, although they are encased in wood because they were originally made in limestone and limestone wares. And so pilgrims have been invited for almost 1,700 years to climb the steps on their knees as a sign of penance. They've been doing this for almost 1,700 years. But it was in 1817, 300 years post-Luther, that the Pope of the day said that if you climb the prescribed stairs in the prescribed manner, you will earn yourself 9 years per step off your time in purgatory. I just have to say, if I ever go to Rome, I will probably go to the Scala Sancta. I will probably get myself a pair of knee pads and I will climb on my knees, not because I'm hoping for 252 years off purgatory, but because it's a holy moment. It's a place to be in specific prayer and to think about holy things. What pushed Luther over the top, of course, was cash payment for sin. Pray the prayer. Make the trip. Climb the stairs on your knees. Okay, you're trying to atone. The intention can be considered honorable. But to say, this is how much the trip would cost me, can I just give it to you and be done with it? And having the church in return say, oh yeah, sure, was to Luther an abomination. And then to have the church itself turn around and say, hey, we're going to make it easy on all of you. Cash. No credit, no checks. Gold, silver, we'll take that, and your sins are indulged. Well, that sent us off to the races on October 31st, 1517. Because you see, when Luther read the story in Luke 7, Jesus didn't say to the woman, your faith has saved you, but you brought ointment. You brought perfumed ointment instead of money. So in 1,000 years, we'll talk about this. To the thief who asked from his own cross that he be remembered when Jesus came into his kingdom. Jesus didn't say, I will remember you, but you dropped your wallet when they nailed you up here. So it's going to be 10,000 years before I'll meet you at the pearly gates. For you and your faith, I'll make it 5. No, that's not what was written. And what was written was not what was being taught. And as I said on that night in 1515, as he wrestled with all these things and all these issues, everything he was reading, and where his spirit was being moved, everything moved at once. Everything became clear. Man is not saved by his actions. He's not saved by his wealth. He is saved by grace, which is a free gift from God. Man need not do things in order to try to earn the favor of God. He need only have faith. And man needs to read the Scriptures above all words. Above all things, the Scriptures must take precedence. The Scriptures must be the words that a man refers to in order to seek to understand God. These are the 3 solas of Luther. Sola fide, only by faith. Sola gratia, only by grace. Sola scriptura, only by the Scriptures. We are not saved by our actions, good though they may be. Going down to Evangel Hall yesterday, preparing the meal on Friday, putting your toonie in the jar or your envelope in the plate, cooking at a church supper, serving on a committee of the church, especially session, earned you no time off a stay in purgatory. Some of my fellow elders might say that session is purgatory already. It's not. It's a good act. It's a responsible act. A response to what God has done for you. But it's not earning you time off because that's not needed. God gives forgiveness when we ask for forgiveness. Grace is a free gift. Not earned, not given with the expectation of repayment. It's not like when you exchange gifts at Christmas and you get the expensive one and you feel guilty because the person that gave you the expensive one, you gave them a knick-knack from the dollar store. This is a free gift. Grace is a free gift that you respond to because your heart says, I've been forgiven. I have been blessed. I have been touched. I have been given something I do not deserve, and yet I have it. The realization of how much you have been forgiven may depend on how much of a sinner you are, or how much of a sinner you see yourself as. I've mentioned before Father Sandy Miller's scale. Father Sandy was the rector at Holy Trinity Brompton in London before Nicky Gumbel arrived, before the man who put together the Alpha program that swept the world. Father Sandy was talking with a new attendee one day, and he was talking to him about grace. And he said, the wall of the church, let's make that the scale. And at the top of the wall is the best people that ever lived. At the bottom of the wall are the worst people who ever lived. Where do you put yourself? The guy said, well, I'm a pretty nice guy. I'll put myself about 2/3 of the way up. Father Sandy says, well, I've looked at myself a little bit and I know where I am, so I put myself 2/3 of the way down. But he says, it doesn't matter. Top of the wall, bottom of the wall. The very holiest human being or the very worst of all. If the word of Jesus Christ is accepted with an honest and contrite heart, they are forgiven. 2 men owed a debt, Jesus said. One 500, one 50. Neither could pay. The lender forgave the debt. Who was more thankful? And Simon answered, I suppose the one who was forgiven the greater debt. Let's hear the words again. Jesus said to him, you have judged rightly. Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she's bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with perfume. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. Hence she has shown great love. But the one whom little is forgiven loves little. So I say to you, think on these things. Find your thoughtful spot, wherever it may be, and think on these things. Man is not saved by law, but by grace. Man is not forgiven his sins by strict adherence to the law, but by the acceptance of grace. God doesn't want us to be legalists. He doesn't want us to be accountants. He wants us to be filled with grace, overflowing with grace, extending grace, living examples of grace at work and in action, now and always. Amen.